Item E is the first item on today's Committee of the Whole agenda. It's the proposed school accreditation standards. I think if Sally and David and Vanessa would join me. The school accreditation standards are being presented as part of MDE's process for presenting this recommendation that I, as superintendent, then need to present to the committees in the legislature. And this is part of a fairly long, ongoing saga. And I'm going to turn it right over to Deputy and Chief Academic Officer Sally Vaughn.
I was going to say an ongoing process, but I guess you could call it a saga.
Process is a better word. Thank you.
Yes. And as the board knows, we have had extensive and significant input and feedback from the field, both from national experts as well as state experts, as well as from educators in the field. And Lisa last month included in her report a summary of what those public comments were. And so today what our plan is to show you how the public comment has now been woven into the Michigan School Accreditation and how those comments have been reflected. Joseph, unfortunately, is out ill, so but I'm very pleased to have with us David Judd and Vanessa Kiesler. They will be going through the PowerPoint with us and be ready to answer questions when they're done. So with that, you want to start? Yes.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and we're excited to be here talking about this today. So we'll jump right in. MCL 380-1280 is our accreditation statute, and this particular area of statute requires that an accreditation system in Michigan address 6 areas of school operation. So we wanted to take a moment in the following slides and explain how what the proposed standards are for each area of school operation and the proposed criteria to measure those standards. The first area of school operation that Michigan School Accreditation addresses is administration and school organization. So again, statute specifies that we need to identify a proposed standard. So the proposed standard here is that the school identifies, plans, and addresses critical elements related to administration and school organization and provides data regarding their plan and progress. And the criteria by which we measure whether or not a school met or exceeded this standard are the submission of annual performance indicators related to administration and school organization, and whether or not the school improvement plan was published. You'll note that's also required by a separate area of Michigan, the Michigan School Code, MCL 380-1280B. Yes?
Are the annual performance indicators, these are defined by whom and where?
The annual performance indicators are a set of reports that are conducted or completed by each school each year. They also interface with the North Central Accreditation work that some schools choose to participate in. So there's a interwoven set of reports that for some schools, when they complete them for North Central Accreditation, they also are their annual performance indicators for state accreditation. For other schools, when they're not at that particular round of their NCA accreditation, they complete them only for state accreditation. Okay. Currently under education, yes, and as proposed here for Michigan School Accreditation.
Who defines the performance indicators?
Those are done collaboratively. OEII actually takes the lead on developing those reports. The
OEII is?
The Office of Educational Improvement and Innovation, and I'm looking for Linda and not seeing her, but Linda Forward's office is, they work to, and again, they do interface with the North Central Accreditation set, so kind of drawing on the full range of research about what makes a good school, how accreditation should be measured, what are reasonable indicators. That's how they're developed, and again, Linda could speak a little bit more fully to that process. That office is the lead on that, but
so if I understand this, then by adopting this, then the criteria are essentially referred to this Office of Education Improvement, which works collaboratively with other accreditation agencies to come up with, to define this list of indicators.
Essentially, the list of indicators were developed, OEII is the lead in terms of understanding how to operationalize and measure how well a school is judging their own performance relative to a set of criteria. They do draw on the best practices of other accreditation agencies, and they also work across the department with other offices within the department, so that the questions that are asked interface with what we need to know about how schools are doing. Okay. All right. Thank you for the question. The second area of school operation identified in the statute is curricula. The standard we are proposing is that the school identifies, plans, and addresses critical elements related to curriculum and provides data regarding their plan and progress. Again, there's a second standard that the required curricula are offered at each school. That's required in a separate area of statute. So that would be the grade level content expectations for elementary, middle school, and the Michigan Merit Curriculum for high schools. The criteria by which we know if a school has done this is, again, the submission of the annual performance indicators related to curricula and assurances included in the school improvement plan that indicate that the school is compliant with MCL 380-1204A requirement to offer the required curricula. The third area of school operation that we are proposing standards for is staff. The standard we are proposing is that the school identifies, plans, and addresses critical elements related to staff and provides data regarding their plan and progress. The second standard is that all staff hold the required certification as required by MCL 380-1233. There are two criteria to measure the extent to which a school meets or exceeds this standard as well. One is the submission of the annual performance indicators related to staff, and the other is an analysis of the Registry of Educational Personnel data by MDE to evaluate the extent to which a school is compliant with the requirement that all staff hold certification. Fourth area of school operation in statute is school and plant facilities. The standard that we are proposing is that the school identifies, plans, and addresses critical elements related to school and plant facilities and provides data regarding their plan and progress. The criteria by which we measure the extent to which a school has met this standard is the submission of their annual performance indicators related to school and plant facilities. The fifth area is school and community relation. The two standards we are proposing are that the school identifies, plans, and addresses critical elements related to school and community relations and provides data regarding their plan and progress, and that they annually publish a fully compliant annual education report as required by a separate area of statute. The two criteria are the submission of the annual performance indicators and assurances in the school improvement plan indicating that they've complied with MCL 380-1204A regarding the annual publication of the annual education report. The sixth and final area of school operation that an accreditation system is required to address is school improvement plan and student performance. So you see there are several standards related to this important area of school operation. One is that the school completes and submits their annual school improvement plan and publishes this plan annually. Again, that is required separately by another area of statute. So we're evaluating the extent to which a school meets or exceeds this standard. The second standard is that the school tests literacy and math annually in grades 1-5. You see there that's a separate statutory requirement as well. The third standard is that the school participates in NAEP if selected. It's not noted on this slide, but that's also in statute separately. The fourth standard is that the school meets or exceeds standards for student achievement, growth in student achievement, improvement in student achievement, achievement gaps, and graduation rate. The fifth standard is that the school meets or exceeds standards for attendance rate, and the sixth standard is that the school meets or exceeds standards for participation rate in assessments as specified by State Board of Education policy. Given the importance of those standards, we have multiple criteria by which we measure the extent to which a school has met or exceeded them, and they're listed there, so I'll go through them quickly. One is the completion and submission of their annual school improvement plan, and assurances in the school improvement plan of compliance with those areas of statute regarding the publication of the SIP. The second criteria is assurances in the SIP of compliance with statute for testing literacy and math in grades 1-5. The third criteria is the participation in NAEP if selected. The fourth criteria is their location on a top to bottom ranking. The fifth criteria is student attendance data. And the sixth criteria is student enrollment and participation data. Yes?
How does participation data differ from attendance data?
Participation data relates to their participation in state assessments. And attendance data is their attendance in school.
Okay. So the test participation data?
Yes.
Okay.
So we have several revisions to Michigan school accreditation based on testimony and public comment, which was conducted recently. The first is MDE would like to propose the removal of the persistently lowest achieving list as a criterion for accreditation decisions. In public comment, there was concern from commenters that this makes it possible for schools not in the lowest 5% on the top to bottom list to be unaccredited because of achievement that is not as low as that of schools that would be accredited. And this is correct, given that the rules regarding the persistently lowest achieving list are governed by federal regulations. So we, had less control over the exact way some of that works than we do over the state-based measures. So our recommendation is that we do remove the persistently lowest achieving list as a criterion. Second proposed change is that we would use average standardized scale scores for the top to bottom calculations rather than percents proficient. We've heard this concern from several venues actually, that there may be a disadvantage to middle schools in particular because in some content areas there's fewer students considered proficient as grade level increases due to how the cut scores function. If we use an average standardized scale score, this eliminates some of that grade level specific concerns, so a school's configuration becomes a non-issue essentially. A third proposed change is that we use a weighted composite of individual student performance level change to calculate improvement in grades 3-8 reading and mathematics. We've heard a lot of comment on our performance level change metric in our grades 3-8 reading and math, and some concerns that they'd like to see enhancements. So we would like to propose right now the way the improvement metric works is that you look at the percent of students who are improving or significantly improving, and you subtract the percent of students who are declining or significantly declining. We would like to weight those different levels of performance level change differently, and you see on the chart it shows how we would like to do this. Before I kind of go through the actual numbers, the reason for this, we'd like to reward large improvements in student performance level more heavily. We would like to reward maintenance of proficiency if a student was previously proficient. So looking at the chart, you can see for a student, if a student was not previously proficient and they significantly decline, that counts against you more heavily than a decline. If you were not previously proficient and you maintain, so you have not grown more closer to proficiency, you don't get any points for that student essentially. And then if you improve or significantly improve, you get 1 point for improvement and 2 points for significant improvement. So again, to differentially reward bigger gains. Yes.
I have a question. And how much of that, the way you're scoring, is the student's social life? Say the student suffers some kind of family issue and stops performing. Now, is that then it's a negative point against the system and against the school because the student's social life is not functioning, or they've moved, or they've got...
Right. Certainly, there are many factors that affect a student's learning every day.
But how is that then recorded? Because, I mean, it could be as easy as on the test date, it was very, very hot.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we have a skewed test. But the results are still going to count against the school system and against the teacher.
Yep. While the department recognizes that there's a lot of factors that can impact student learning, we do hold schools accountable for targeting and addressing the achievement of all students equally. It's not possible in a testing setting or data setting to account for everything that's going on in the student's life. So we do recognize that there are a lot of things, but it's not something that's easily accounted for in this situation. We do try to build some protections into the system so that one student having a bad day, or there was a fight at home that morning and they had a really bad day, won't throw the school off entirely. But at an individual student level, it is true that a score could reflect something that's going on outside of the classroom, but that's not something that we can control or measure adequately. So,
And it's not just the individual as well. Like, sometimes it's cyclical. For example, the incoming freshman class this year, they're going to have a lot more maintenance than the outgoing freshman class, and so it's very cyclical. So the nature of a class, and it just could be a combination of characteristics, can completely and absolutely skew the results, but the results are so important and so weighed against the performance of the school. I don't understand if you see that the testing method is very, it's not really fair, then why are you using the results to really punish, or not punish, that's really strong, but you know, to grade that school based on this particular generation of students versus that particular generation of students?
we believe our assessments are fair to the extent that they are keyed to our published grade level content expectations. They're checked rigorously for bias and for content. They cover the content expectations, they're reliable, and they're valid. So we think that they are a fair measure of student performance relative to our content standards. It's difficult to develop any standardized assessment that would measure everything about a student. We know that that's just true of any sort of psychological testing or anything. It's hard to capture it all. But we do believe our tests are fair measures of what a student knows and is able to do.
Yeah, Matinga, the other thing I would say is the participation rate is at 95%, exactly for some of the reasons you've mentioned, that trying to say that 100% of the students have got to be tested gives the districts absolutely no latitude when you have a small number of students that may have had some issues. So that's built in as a safety guard for that. And to have one whole cohort of, let's say, freshmen come in and be, let's say, a challenging group, don't forget that any of the consequences as a result of the accreditation system, that has to be for consecutive years. So if you have a blip, it's a blip. And so it's never a one-shot, one time at 1 year, kind of a snapshot of what's happening.
It is. It's a consecutive years, and then it even says state superintendent may.
May.
I mean, this, just to get perspective, I know this is an attempt to improve the current system that's required in law. The current system has no schools that are unaccredited out of 4,000. And then even if they were, the stakes are, as Sally's kind of saying, not as high as one would think when you look at this because of the consecutive nature. And then even then, I think it gives discretion to whoever's in this seat to make decisions about who knows what maybe happened. Maybe there, I don't want to describe a real extreme case, but a real extreme case came to my mind where you would say that describes why there was an event that created a different situation for that school.
And I'm sorry to beat this horse, but you know, there's an assumption that it's the 365 days or the 182 days that the student is in the school is kind of like a sitcom. It ends in some kind of, you know, wrapped up really neatly so that you can, you know, next year they should show improvement. Sometime a school may put a new initiative, and you may not be able to see the results for 4 years. That entire generation of students has to go through before the kinks are worked out, and then the next generation of students will benefit from that, and there is no gap for that. So it may be 4 consecutive years that this school is struggling, but I think you're discouraging innovation, because if you're punishing them if they don't get better consecutive years, sometimes it just takes more than 1 year to seriously test, especially when, again, so many factors are involved. And we're dealing with children. Right. And that's my last comment, sorry.
You know, because one thing I think we'd have to acknowledge is the whole system deals with these issues, including teacher tests on a given day, including finals that kids are subjected to, including SAT and ACT scores. So to the degree your points are valid, this is valid of our whole system, and we need to evolve to something that doesn't just measure those things. I mean, that point's well taken. I'm only trying to bring down a little bit of the punishment mindset, because there really isn't, it's not the nature of this system when we have 0 right now out of 4,000. And I think there are better ways to get to this over time, by the way, that I'm not sure the law requires this now. I'm not sure that's the answer in the long run is accreditation. There are other things that are seeming to be that you're inferring a better way to think about school improvement, and I think we'll evolve into that. But we're at least, even if this is approved quickly, which, you know, by the legislature and others, it's still a matter of at the earliest the year after next. I'm correct about that. And then it would have to be 3 consecutive years. So, I mean, you really, and then even then, all the may have consequences. So I'm only emphasizing that because I think you're making a good point about the system in general relies, in individual classrooms even, not to mention statewide, on tests maybe in a way that might be disproportionate to understanding where a student's growth is. Yes, sir. Richard.
I just wanted to observe that these tests are not being used to assess children. They're being used to assess the school. And so the assumption that there will be some bad days for some kids and home stuff that assumption is built into the testing. Tests are like taking a picture of the ocean. You know, one time the waves are up, another time the waves are down. How do you get a picture of the level of the ocean? Well, you get as many photographs as possible, and that's what testing of large numbers of students, the errors cancel each other out, and we can have we can decide whether the tide is rising or whether it's going down on given schools by these aggregate tests. So we need to, again, you can overread, you can overuse tests and misinterpret, but they are useful, I think, for the purpose that's being proposed here.
I think what Mike...
Kathleen, please.
I would say that I
Kathleen
think
and David.
Tanya's putting her finger on a concern that a lot of us have, the whole country has put too much emphasis on standardized testing and putting grading schools based on those tests. And it's a concern that I've had for a long time. I think that you're trying to make it as fair as you can, given the system, that we have to do these things. But I for one, have been very concerned that we put so much emphasis on testing, and maybe I mean, this has been going on for as long as I've been on the board, standardized standards and testing, and I keep getting worried that we eliminate the creativity of the teachers because they get so concerned about not only the teachers, but the administrators putting the pressure on the teachers to make sure your kids do well on the tests. The whole system is wound up in the testing, and
right.
I think it's a concern that I have. I don't know how to deal with it, to
Yeah,
be honest, except to make it as fair as we can, and I think you're trying to do that. So I'd just like to express my view that maybe somehow or other we have to, while we want to make sure the schools are doing a good job, if we can dream up some other way to do this rather than putting so much emphasis on standardized testing and the one-day tests. I'd like to find it. I wish I could figure out a way, but I am concerned about this.
Just the perspective, again, I feel like I'm coming at this in different ways, and I, at the risk of overstating it, there's not one child in this state that has suffered because of unaccreditation. And yet, last week, I'm assuming there are many kids who didn't pass a course by 1 point, who, as a result, have to retake the course. So the system is very much engaged in this at the classroom level. And there hasn't been a consequence yet for a student at an unaccredited level. But every day there is in terms of the tests that they receive in the system, from either required by the district or required by the teacher. So to the degree that those are, I would share many of those concerns. I'm only saying there hasn't been any consequence to it at an accreditation level. There's consequences as recently as last week, the kids who failed a final by 1 point and as a result have to retake the course or go in the summer. And I think you're making good points about how we evolve a system beyond just that.
Right.
And I think it was Eileen and then Nancy. And then David had something in a moment.
And I would be the first one to support non-standardized testing if I knew that all of our teachers were totally prepared for what they face in the classroom and they had an administration that was willing to let those teachers who are aligned with the curriculum, everything, all the stars line up. I think it's not just the testing that we have to look at, the assessment. I think it's how we prepare teachers. I think it's whether or not school administrators understand that the responsibility to produce student outcome can go with freedoms for teachers. And I'd love to see the whole system be different, but I think we're going to have to start with the teaching force, helping them get the tools they need before they'll be able to remove testing.
It was Nancy and then David.
I'm going to ask for a procedural thought on the part of the board. When we have presentations like this that have a continuation, a continuity based on the presentation, and we continually interrupt that continuity, I think we kind of lose sight sometimes of some of the points being made. And so I would ask us as board to kind of hold off on our comments and questions until after the presentation is made. You know, we've got pens and we can write on the corner here what it is we want to ask questions about. But I think this is a case in point. All of a sudden we're talking about focus on testing when the last 4 slides have been about everything but testing. So I think that if we could do that, I think it would help us get a bigger picture and help us make more substantive comments. So
I'll try to do that.
That's my thought. I don't know if the board wants to do that.
Second.
Why don't we do that? That's my fault for kind of getting off task there. But if we can, we'll finish the presentation, and then please,
Yeah.
as you're saying, as Nancy said, make some notes, and we'll go on.
So, so with the improvement metric here, the big takeaway is that we wanted to make a change to be sure to reward, especially in that previously proficient, that bottom row, a school that has a number of students who are already proficient and keeps them proficient would now be rewarded for doing that, whereas in the previous system, maintenance was not rewarded or punished. So this was comment we received from the field extensively, and it was very good comment, very good feedback, and more fair to the hard work that schools do around student performance. So we'd like to propose this weighting to treat improvement differently depending on where the student was starting and how far you moved them. A similar change we'd like to propose is some changes to help us avoid what we're calling ceiling effects. For very high-performing schools, they run out of room to show improvement at some level. If all the students are already performing well, then you can't show improvement because you've gotten there. And in a system that includes a focus on improvement, you could be at a disadvantage, which is obviously counterintuitive to what we want. We want schools to be high-performing. So we have 2 proposals here. One is that with the performance level change metric, students who are in the highest performance level, so that would be the advanced category, those students would automatically be counted as improving when we're looking at individual student improvement. Because if you are in the advanced performance level, you don't have much room to go, and even staying there is good work on the part of the school. The second is that we propose not to incorporate improvement slopes in a school's overall score if the school reaches a proficiency level or a graduation rate at or above 90%. So once you get to a proficiency level of 90%, we no longer would look to see, are you improving over time, because you've really run out of room to have your slope be very positive on the uptick. Plus 90% proficiency is a pretty good level of proficiency. In February, in our presentation, when we spoke about what we were thinking about the standards at that time, we talked about achievement gaps and not looking at AYP anymore, but looking at achievement gaps in the school. We would like to propose, after public comment, that we look at achievement gaps by looking at the difference between the top scoring 30% of students and the bottom scoring 30% of students, instead of looking at the AYP subgroups. During public comment, we heard significant feedback that looking at AYP subgroups is problematic because different schools will have different subgroups. Some subgroups are more prevalent than others, and it can cause different schools to be ranked on different criteria. If we use a top 30% versus bottom 30%, all schools are compared on the same criteria. Everybody has a top 30, everybody has a bottom 30. And it also makes sure that the maximum number of schools will have an achievement gap included in their ranking. If you looked for everybody, if you went on subgroups, everybody'd have to have a subgroup that was big enough. Doing it this way, everybody will have a gap, almost everybody except for very small schools will have a gap. And so that will help us include that as a metric for more schools. And really, from a policy perspective, it puts the focus on ensuring that all students receive adequate instruction, regardless of which subgroup. It's important that you have high-achieving students and that even your low-achieving students, you focus on their achievement to bring them up and close that gap, regardless of subgroup. So how would a school's accreditation status be calculated? And these next slides use the changes we just proposed in the previous slides to show how it would work. These next slides do go into some deeper detail. We'd heard some feedback over time that people wanted a more complete and detailed explanation in this setting. So we're going to dive a little deeper today. Hopefully we'll have a good time doing that together.
As Lisa says, if you talk too many times about Z-scores, she will Z out.
So a school's initial accreditation status would be calculated. We'll talk first about how their status would be calculated. Initially, it would be calculated based on the top to bottom ranking as determined based on the criteria in the proposed standards. So if a school is in the bottom 5% on that top to bottom ranking, which I'll remind you includes achievement, improvement, achievement gap, and graduation rate. So top to bottom ranking includes multiple criteria itself. If the school is in the bottom 5% on that ranking, the initial accreditation status is unaccredited. If the school is in the bottom 20%, but above the bottom 5%, the initial accreditation status is interim accredited. And please note that interim accredited is substantively like accredited, not like unaccredited. Unaccredited only applies to unaccredited. Interim accredited is
Still accredited.
it's still accredited, but you're in an interim status. It's a warning to schools to beware, be alert. Otherwise, if the school is above the 20th percentile, its initial status is accredited. The next step would be to calculate their final accreditation status based on factors other than performance on state tests. So those are all those criteria that we outlined that address the various proposed standards for the area of school operations. We score them yes or no. Either you met the criteria or you did not. If the school has missed any one of the factors for 2 consecutive years, including different factors in each year, then that initial accreditation status from the ranking would be lowered 1 level, if possible. So this is the question of the day, and this is where we do talk Z-scores, so I'll try to make it as painless as possible. But how is the top to bottom ranking calculated? Again, this integrates those changes that we just went through that we'd like to propose to the superintendent as the criteria by which we do this. So for grade 3-8 reading and mathematics, so remember these are the grades in which we have adjacent grade testing, so we can look at individual student performance level change and then aggregate that to a school level to understand school level change over time. The first step at the top left, you see it says 2-year average standardized student scale Z-score. This integrates that change where we take each student's score on the test and we standardize it. So that standardizes out those grade level differences to make sure that there's no incentive or reason or penalty for having higher level grades than lower level grades. And you average that over 2 years. This helps with some of the points that were made around the table regarding it might be a bad year. By using a 2-year average, you help standardize out blips, bad years. But it's also not a 3-year or a 4-year so that bad year doesn't kind of stick with you for a long time. You've got 2 years to help smooth it out, but if there is a bad year, it'll be gone shortly. The second step, so this is to measure a student's achievement or school level student achievement. The second step, if you move to the right, the next box, is the school achievement Z-score. So once we get that average standardized score for the school, we figure out where it is relative to all the other schools, either elementary, middle schools, or high schools. So we say, are you above the average? Are you below the average? And that's what goes in that box. A Z-score essentially compares a school score to the statewide average in a standardized way so we can understand distance from that average. And that achievement counts as 1/2 of the final content area index. So achievement is weighted more heavily than improvement, and it's weighted more heavily than gap. There's two reasons for that. One is we are concerned as a state with the achievement of our students. We want students to be proficient. We want them to be on track for career and college readiness. So that is what we privilege as a goal for our students. The second is that it's a more stable measure than the other two. So there's a methodological reason as well as policy reason. Okay, drop down to the next row. The next row is the improvement metric. So that left-hand box, I should have a laser pointer, the left-hand box in the middle, it says 2-year average performance level change index. Again, looking at each student and whether they improved, significantly improved, maintained, declined, or significantly declined, and weighting those changes as we described in a previous slide, you would get for the school an average amount of change. So you take all the students who improved or significantly improved, subtract the number of students who declined or significantly declined, again weighted as we did, and you get a school measure. The second step is the box right to the right, the same as we did with achievement, is to compare that metric to all the other schools, all the other elementary, middle schools, or all the other high schools to see whether or not that school's amount of change was at the average, above average, or below average. Improvement counts as 1/4 of the final index for the content area. The reason for this, as said before, is that it is very important. We want to, as a state, focus on moving students forward, moving students up, school improvement, that this is about improving student achievement and proficiency, and that's not always an immediate thing. That takes time, and schools do a lot of hard work to accomplish that with their students, and that should be rewarded. It's weighted at 1/4 because it's a less stable measure and because it's, again, we want them still getting to the achievement. And then the final step is the calculation of the gap. That's the bottom row. So we look at the 2-year average gap between the bottom 30% and the top 30%. We calculate a z-score on that gap to say, is your gap larger, same, smaller than other schools in the state, where smaller gaps are what we're looking for. So a smaller gap would give you a better ranking. You want to have small gaps between your students. And the gap metric is also weighted at 1/4. And so you combine those 3 metrics to create the school content area index. I'm going to ask if it's okay if I stop and ask for questions there, even though there was an excellent suggestion that we not stop in the presentation. I know that this is a point in time when people usually have questions.
Cassandra, and then Richard, and then Marianne.
Can you just clarify one more time, because I'm a little confused? The top row is achievement.
Mm-hmm.
The second row is
Improvement.
improvement. And the difference between achievement and improvement is?
Achievement is kind of a status measure. Where are you? Are you proficient or are you not? And improvement is how are you changing over time?
Got it.
Ideally, getting better, but
Okay.
potentially.
Thank you.
Yep.
Richard, and Marianne.
And these are all based on MEP score?
MEP, MME, My Access, and MEP Access, our continuum of assessments.
Okay.
Marianne, please.
I just wanted to clarify in a very short, abbreviated way that Z means, other than it's a comparison of the school to the state average score.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
And
Vanessa.
the last comment I'll make on this is we do feel that these 3 metrics working together for each index help create a good tension where schools are rewarded for getting their students to a high level of achievement, they're rewarded for improving students, and they're rewarded for closing their gaps. So we've heard people say things like, well, you could close your gap by having your lowest achieving students do worse. Technically, yes. But the other parts of the metric would preclude that, not to mention the fact that it's unlikely any school would actually pursue that as an option. But there's a nice tension between these measures that really put the focus on what a high-achieving school does. Okay, this looks suspiciously the same, and it is. It is for science, social studies, and writing in elementary and middle schools, and for all grade 11 testing, because it is in those grades that we don't have adjacent grade testing. The only difference here is right in the middle of the slide. The improvement metric here, rather than being that individual level, performance level change from year to year, how did you do this year, how did you do next year, at a student level, is that we have to use a 4-year achievement trend slope. So it's saying at a school level, from year to year, how did you do in terms of the number of students who were proficient from year to year. So, the middle line, starting on the left, we start by looking at calculating the 4-year achievement trend slope, and there's a graphic a little bit later that kind of illustrates that. And then we calculate a z-score to say, where does that slope, how is that slope relative to the average slope for all other either elementary middle schools or high schools in the state? Are you above, are you at the average, or are you below? And then that feeds into the final content area index at a quarter, just like the performance level change metric. The other two function the same way. So unless anybody would like me to, I'm not going to restate the other two. Okay. For graduation rate, which is part of the top to bottom ranking, there's two aspects to it. There's the rate itself, and then there's improvement in the rate. Again, recognizing that it is important that we graduate our students, but it's also important that we improve our graduation rate over time. So creating that tension between where are you and are you moving toward a goal. So the first step of calculating this part of the metric is to determine the 2-year average graduation rate. And that's nice and simple. Just grad rate over 2 years, what was it? And then turn that into a z-score like we have all along. So say, where is your graduation rate relative to all the other schools with a graduation rate in the state? The second step is to calculate the improvement trend. So we look at 4-year graduation rate trend slope using the 4-year cohort graduation rate, and calculate a 4-year slope on that, and then compare that slope to all other schools with a graduation rate to see if you're at, above, or below. And combine those into the final graduation rate index, which is 2/3 rate and 1/3 improvement. Again, privileging where you are at with your rate more than improvement, but recognizing the importance of improving over time.
Vanessa, if I may, this is a reminder again to everyone here, certainly most importantly the board, that these are improvements that we're suggesting based on the public hearings. These are revisions. So at one time you saw in this saga or in this process, there wasn't credit, if that's the right way to put it, for graduation rate. And there was the AYP factor that many had concerns about, but the board also had concerns about that there was at least some acknowledgement of gap. So just a reminder again, these are the revisions that are based on this is very hearing friendly. And let me just say, those who've been at the hearings or have read the transcripts of the hearings, these hearings are by folks in the field predominantly. So, it's a context that sometimes when we're looking at the math and thinking about the math, it almost feels like it's another gotcha or something. This is actually very friendly to what we heard from the field through the hearings, and just wanted to kind of reiterate that.
And this was a specific change made via the recommendation of a group of stakeholders earlier in the year. And thank you for reminding us, Superintendent. This is the graphic I spoke of, just to show how a 4-year slope is calculated. So the way you do it is you plot the school's graduation rate, and this would also work for the proficiency rates over the last 4 years. And then you plot a linear regression line through the points, just a line. And then you calculate the slope of that line, which is the school's annual improvement rate. So just to show when we're talking about the 4-year slope, that's the methodology that's used. So now we've calculated for every school indices in each of the content areas, as well as graduation rate, and we combine these together to generate an overall school index. So if a school has all five content areas with a sufficient number of students assessed over the previous 2 years, and they have a graduation rate, then you combine those 6 indices together where the content areas are weighted at 18% apiece and graduation rate is rated at 10%. Graduation rate will always count as 10%, and then the remaining 90 will be parceled out by the number of content areas in which you assessed an adequate number of students. So here's an example of a school that doesn't have a graduation rate. It would be, their overall school index would be calculated based on 20% per content area. And here's an example of a school with missing writing. They didn't assess an adequate number of students in writing. Their grade levels where they assessed were small or something, because we do have an end size that you have to reach. So in that case, each of the 4 remaining content areas would count as 25% in the overall school index. And then the final step, as you see the arrow to the right, we finally made it all the way through these slides, is from that overall school index, you rank those indices, and you get the school's overall school percentile rank. And that is their rank on the statewide top-to-bottom ranking.
Questions at that point?
Okay.
Yeah, is there?
Good job.
Okay, Dave's going to do the next few slides.
Okay, David.
All right. One of the big goals of this information is not only the bottom of the list, but the top. I mean, we want to make sure this information is accurate, as we've talked about, and equated. But we want to get the information out to folks so that they can make decisions, and we actually know the schools that are doing very well that we can share that information. So that's one of the reasons why we put so much emphasis on making fair tests according to our standards. So one of the goals is transparency. Again, we've had a lot of input, as Vanessa and Superintendent Flanagan talked about, from the field, and we've altered this process. Systems are important. We want to make sure that this system is something that people could look at and understand. There's complexity to it because we've tried to embed the changes as we've gotten input from the field, and as you guys have looked at it and kind of commented on it as well. But we believe that this will help with student achievement. We really believe that, and we need to give access to this data to folks, to the stakeholders especially. There's a dashboard that you may have seen with the governor's working on, that we're also working on with our partners, the Center for Education, Performance and Information, CEPI. We want to make sure that this information is out there in such a way that's usable. This is a mock-up. This is an early concept. It's a draft only, but it shows you some of the elements that, as you can see, our existing Michigan Accreditation, the Education Yes is there, adequate yearly progress, we'll report that out, and then there's the points of pride that local schools and districts are able to input data, and we collect so that can be used as reporting. So this is, again, not exactly what it'll look like. We want to mention the name of the portal that we're working on. It's called My School Data. Hopefully you've maybe heard that or be seeing that this summer as that rolls out, but it's My School Data. And we think it'll be a great information sharing place to put this education data. So again, we know that it's complex. I think Vanessa did a fantastic job explaining it, going through it with flow charts to kind of show, but there's complexity to it. We've tried to build in some of those detailed specifics that make it fair for all school districts, large, medium, small, and schools, and we want to make sure that equals transparency. And just because it's complex doesn't mean that that's not transparent. I guess we have make sure that transparency does not equal simplicity. Again, that we know that we've done the best we can to start with a simple model, and we've added to it, but we've tried to keep it as logical as possible. Transparency does not equal the ability for external verification, and it also includes providing details on the system's complexity. So that's one thing that we have as a goal, is to make sure that people can replicate this model. And again, Superintendent Flanagan mentioned it well. We have listened. We have worked, the staff, Vanessa and Joseph have been very diligent with their staff and our psychometricians to make sure this model is accurate and it's measuring what we want it to measure.
David, by the way, probably a good time for me to interject. One other strength among many that David brings to the team is David's a local school board member, so he hears about these things from another perspective also, not just from kind of imposing, but from trying to understand at the real grassroots level the way this is going to look to your constituents. And
thank you. Yeah, it is interesting to see the data, how it's used. It's a small school district. I'll mention it. Shout it out. Thanks to Mike Olivet, and we're proud of how we've done. But the MEP data has limitations. We know that. We use it as a measuring point, but we make sure we balance it with everything else that's happening in the district. And we hope that this information that comes out will be helpful for small school districts like Olivet to large school districts across the state. And we really believe the light of day and the sharing of information is powerful. And we want to share the success stories as well. And that's part of the benefit, I think, of tools like this that we're developing. So thank you. We know the professional development, the learning piece, we need to get that out so people do understand this model. And we don't want to just put it out there and have people kind of sort through it. We want to make sure that the technical assistance is there, the access to the data is there for folks that really want to utilize it in the classroom. That's where it's really powerful. So our plans would be to make the full data file available with the business rules so that the replication can be replicated. I mean, the calculations can be replicated and actually verified. Provide that technical support, the documentation, of course our office with the email support and phone. We know that there'll be questions as this gets out there. We definitely want to provide that, and as well as on-site support as we have resources permitted to go into different schools and districts and kind of explain this and train and do our best to make sure people understand what you can do with the data and maybe what you shouldn't do with the data, kind of the appropriate uses of it.
And if I could just reinforce what David was talking about, is the tension between the complexity and the transparency. This came about in every single stakeholder group pretty much that we brought together. It's a balance, it's a delicate balance, that if you don't have enough complexity, you lose the nuances of what's happening in the school. So the trade-off and the balance is, how do you have enough complexity to give a true picture of the school without making it so complicated? So I think this one has some complexity to it, but we have ways that we can make it transparent to people so they actually can replicate it. And that will be what we'll be focusing on when we do some of the professional development modules, is to walk them through pretty much what we did with you, but in much more of a professional training cycle, so they've got an in-depth knowledge of how it works.
Thank you, Sally. We are also looking at developing technical tools. We know that we can't go everywhere in the state with the staff we have, so we want to develop pieces that can be shared electronically as well, so that these modules can be used for training in the schools and districts.
So we wanted to go through the consequences and a few clarifications, and Sally and the superintendent already alluded to this, but specifically, what are the consequences in state law for a school that is unaccredited? So according to state law, a school that has been unaccredited for 3 consecutive years is subject to one or more of the following measures as determined by the superintendent of public instruction. And this was the point the superintendent made earlier, that there is a level of superintendent discretion written into the law. So the measures specified in statute that the superintendent may choose to employ are to appoint an administrator, allow parents to send their child to an accredited school within the district, require that the school align itself with research-based school improvement model, or close the school. We want to underscore these 2 points, and I made this point earlier, but it bears repeating, that both accredited and interim accredited are considered to be accredited. You are not considered to be unaccredited unless you are unaccredited, period. So that's very important that we make sure that that distinction is well understood. The second is that a school must be unaccredited for 3 consecutive years in order for these sanctions to potentially apply. So if you are unaccredited, interim accredited, unaccredited, that's not 3 consecutive years. Your clock restarts with that 3rd year of unaccredited. So just to be clear about how and this is all statutorily specified. So that is what the statute specifies. That's how it will interact with those potential sanctions.
And just again, a little bit of perspective or context might be the right way to think about it. The current reform law has far more severe and immediate consequences. So it's not to say all of this is important, but it's kind of like, what's more likely to happen? There are 92 schools right now that are subject to whether or not they are, quote, taken over based on whether or not they are improving. And they are in this school reform law now. And the only reason I mention that is I'm trying to build context about the concerns that I think it's not hard to misunderstand this when you don't do it every day. So I run into people. One reason I pretty much every week have some kind of a forum, and often I'm, somewhat respectfully, but still confronted, is you start to see heads nodding when you realize, oh, wait a minute, no, you're mixing up accreditation with the reform law, and you're mixing this up, and you're not. And that's why I think the forums and other things that have been in place are ways to help people understand the system. And if anything, those I find anyway, in the ones I'm about, take fear out, because there's a heck of a lot less of this than people have to have. But when there's so much of it out there, and then I think, as Matinga's reminding us, and I hear from my daughter, if the feeling is that these changes are also punishments or judgments about teachers, it is demoralizing, and it can have an effect exactly the opposite of what we want to have, where people think, well, why the heck am I going to get into teaching? You know, I mean, this thing's like, so I mean, these balances are important, and why the communication's important to keep in kind of this context of what this really is. And what this is doing the best we can to ensure that our kids are on a track to career and college ready, and that, you know, they're in a different world than most of us grew up in because of the complexity of the global economy, and yet not in a way that suddenly has folks, or, you know, my daughter's doing fine, but come home and think, you know, what the heck, can't we do anything right? So I mean, this is the importance of communication in this whole arrangement also.
Thank you. And just to underscore what David presented too, that the real power in this system is the power for information to drive instruction, to help schools target their work, to use their data for a powerful purpose. So the importance of transparency and professional learning and things like that, that's where the power in the system really is. We wanted to address several common concerns we heard in public comment. As mentioned previously, our full response to public comment was submitted last month, but there were a few kind of overarching ones we wanted to address. One was that there has not been sufficient interaction with the field to design the system. And we appreciate why that may appear to be that way. So we wanted to underscore how we have sought feedback to reassure all of us that we have tried to work with a diverse group of stakeholders. So you see a list there that includes the original referent groups, our advisory committees, national experts. We've had 3 rounds of public hearings, the most recent in April of this year. We've done statewide surveys. We've done at least 30 presentations to various groups. A new referent group was begun in 2010 related to the ranking, and again, that's where the graduation rate addition came from. And then this continuing ongoing support with the field, that's what our office does with a lot of its time. So, and we have each recommended revision to Michigan School Accreditation has been preceded by feedback and comment. So we've tried to listen and respond and build a system that balances complexity with transparency and with rigor and fairness to schools. Another concern is that Michigan School Accreditation is too normative and competitive, that a criterion reference system would be better. One of the reasons a normative system is positive in this setting is that it does protect against a large number of schools becoming unaccredited, particularly in a time when there's changes in the assessment system. So if you had a criteria and you said you have to get X number of students proficient, at the same time that assessment systems are changing and cut scores are changing, you could end up with a very large number of schools not able to meet that criteria, whereas a ranking is a normative system protects against that happening. We've also added the sunset clause that was discussed at the February meeting, so that when even the lowest 5% of Michigan schools are adequately preparing students for the next level of education, we'll revise the system and think about, you know, maybe another criterion reference system, or maybe by then there will be some new way to do this that's more appropriate. But at this time, we feel a normative system is actually it's a protection for a lot of schools. Another concern we've heard is that we should wait for ESEA reauthorization. Although we would all like to see, I think, ESEA reauthorized soon, it may still be several years away from everything we're hearing. And we need to take responsibility for our lowest performing of Michigan schools now, not wait for the federal government to instigate those changes. And also any changes to the accreditation system that are necessitated by some future ESEA revision can be accommodated. There is an accreditation revision process written into the statute for precisely this reason, that the system needs to be a living system that can have revisions at appropriate times. So we've heard repeatedly the concern that accreditation is based only on performance on state tests. I think this presentation lays out pretty clearly that accreditation is based on the extent to which a school meets or exceeds standards in the 6 areas of school operation. Performance of on state tests is only one criteria related to one of the standards. So in order for a school to be fully accredited, they have to meet or exceed the standards in all 6 areas of accreditation. Failure to meet any one of those standards causes a school to lose full accreditation. So While it is true that failing to meet the standards for student performance, which is measured by multiple criteria, not just state tests, could cause you to lose full accreditation, it's also true that failing to meet standards for school and plant facilities could cause you to lose full accreditation. You have to meet the standards in each of the areas. And, again, we've extensively outlined all the criteria, all the standards, and how they relate to the 6 areas. Hopefully that will bring some clarity to this concern, which is a valid concern. We've heard the concern that this system seems punitive and that it creates a stigma for schools if they're unaccredited. The Michigan School Accreditation System, as proposed here, is rigorous. And we do believe that it is rigorous, and it sets the following expectations for schools. It asks that schools achieve high levels of student performance for all of their students. It asks that schools achieve high levels of improvement. It asks that they achieve high levels of graduation, that our students are completing high school. We're asking that schools comply with state statute and that they comply with State Board of Education policy. And we rigorously ask that they do those things. We consider that schools who can meet those thresholds really exemplify a solid definition of a successful school. So we believe that schools that don't demonstrate these characteristics should be concerned about the level of education their students are receiving and less about the stigma that may be associated with the school for poorly preparing students for the next level of education. It is really important, it's vitally important that our students be prepared to go on and succeed, and we know that. So we believe a school that does these things does that for students, and that needs to be the focus in the system. There's our contact information.
Okay. Mike, we'll turn it back over to you.
Sandra and John. Kathy.
Well, I think we all know that over the last couple of years, this process has really morphed, and I think that this is a tremendous improvement, and I really appreciate the work that you guys have put into this, because I know it's been a very trying exercise, if you will, but I think that what you've laid out today really addresses a lot of concerns that many people have had, including folks here on the board, and so I appreciate the hard work that you guys have put into this. I just have a couple quick questions. Actually, you answered most of them. So, one quick question. You talked about the superintendent may impose these 4 different things for the schools. So, the question then would become, okay, I end up unaccredited for 3 years in a row. What is the process that I go through at that point? Do I sit down with the state superintendent and talk about my options, or does the superintendent impose them, and then is there an appeals process to that?
Help me with this. Yeah.
To be perfectly frank, we don't have the process completely developed because we've never needed it.
It's 4 years out
Right.
at the earliest.
We've never needed it.
And this is one reason I was trying to put perspective on this. There's far more stuff right now that's happening with the 92 schools that could be taken over tomorrow by not showing enough improvement. And then that is appealable from, if the reform officer made that decision, to the state superintendent, which is final. So there's probably some parallel process we'd want to think about in that regard.
Okay.
But I do think that it's not to, well, I'm repeating myself, but for context on the current system with the reform office compared to this anyway, and this is 4 years off at the earliest.
So
we
the
would have
process
to,
is in process?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the continuing process, or I would rather say a continuing saga, but Sally's reminded me it's a process. So.
But doing it thoughtfully is an opportunity.
It is an opportunity.
To,
I mean,
to do it well.
We'll learn
in
more.
conjunction with the stakeholders, right?
You know, if 2 years from now, when the first, based on this instead of Ed, yes. Did I have that right, or did I misspeak earlier? Yeah, so it wouldn't be based on next school year, which is Ed, yes. I mean, Ed, yes, for this current.
We've got we've still got a process to follow. So you have to, we have to give you the recommendations for your consideration, and then you have to submit it to the House and Senate Ed committees for them to approve it. So it depends on when that process.
I guess I didn't word that very well. The earliest would be 2 years out. And then 2 years out, I think we're going to learn something, but you're hesitating, so you're welcome to clarify that if you think it's.
It could be this coming year,
Yeah, I mean,
potentially.
it's all timing
Yeah.
on how long the process takes. if the process got completed fairly soon, staff could probably gear out to be able to implement it in this next school year.
Okay, well, that's my misunderstanding. Even then, though, that's a time for us to understand now, so what happened with that? How many schools actually fell into these three categories? And then you start probably preparing, as Cassandra's saying, for a process about what would that mean 3 years from then. And even then, I mean, if I'm a local superintendent, as I was, not to mention a principal and a board, you are going to have this corrected by your third year. I don't know how, you're going to have strategies in place to make sure this works. It's one reason I think the importance of people understanding the metrics and the PD that David and Vanessa talked about that goes on, because you would address these weaknesses, and they're going to step up to it. So even then, one of the, I don't want to call it a frustration, I mean, the law requires us to have the system, but is that the fear has far exceeded the actual likely.
Yeah, and I guess that's the basis for my question is if they are down in the process of addressing those issues, you know, is it going to be like the federal thing where you come in and say, oh, sorry, you got to get rid of your principal because that's what we have to do?
No, I think, I don't want to be too specific about it, but for instance, right now I have not forced the issue on a principal being replaced in a given building under the reform law.
Yeah.
So I mean, but I get to your point. I think this is a process, as Sally says, and the real helpful thing will be if we are able to see it this first year, you'd see a distribution of where they are in the three categories and learn from that. I think. John, and Kath, and Mary Ann.
And echoing Cassandra, you all have done tremendous work in making very thoughtful changes based on the real concerns and issues out there, and I think all of us, you know, happily, I think we've all waded in and tried to understand and appreciate the nature of what kind of accreditation regime makes the most sense. You know, I was even looking at the law, imagine that, and I just wanted to reinforce it. It does say very clearly the superintendent has the ability to make this certification in conjunction with the House and Senate committees and has some discretion in that regard, which should be some point of reassurance. But also I think it's very healthy and appreciate having the board sort of give it some thoughtful input and policy imprimatur on this system makes it more stick in a thoughtful way, so appreciate that. I just want to make a couple points and then push on one question, and that's, you know, I really think the formula at the center of this and how we balance growth, achievement, graduation rates, you know, is as thoughtful and effective a recipe as we can make, and appreciate that. It is a topic that all states and all school communities trying to do similar accountability systems are trying to get right as well. So there's no perfect answer there, but the formula and the tensions you describe, I think we have the balance right. It does kick out of this, you know, a set of schools that, if they persist over time, are not delivering education for their kids, and that's what we want an accreditation system to do. I think separating the lists of persistently low achieving, which has some higher achieving schools within it, from the target that we want to set for our state efforts and trying to crosswalk that is healthy. As you know, the one concern some of our stakeholders and many of us have is how can we also provide support and weight to the non-student performance indicators? You know, does the school have a good staffing plan and a school improvement plan? How would we know, and what kind of technical assistance and effort can we make to support them in effectiveness in these non-areas, non-performance, student performance areas? You know, and the law suggests we can ask the ISDs or work with them to provide support on those domains. How are we able to do that to also provide meaningful support in the non-student performance areas, which I know is of concern to many?
Well, the ISDs obviously are critical, and we've been working, we worked with them for a number of years, in both with the statewide system of support, but as well, the nice thing is that when we provide something to those schools that are receiving school improvement grants, The others can also participate. We can't pay for them to participate, but they can participate, so they can take advantage of the training that's going on. But doing in-depth technical assistance is going to be dependent on whether or not there's additional state funding provided for staff to do that. As you all know, we are basically a federally funded department, so we don't have a lot of state-funded people to provide that state service. So we really are going to be relying on the ISDs to provide some of those services. And Linda, I don't know if you wanted to add?
No, I think that encompasses what we can do. The thing to remember is that while we can provide a lot of support for Title I receiving schools, our hands are tied when it gets to schools that don't receive those services. And so while we can't pay for them to come, we will invite them. We're going to have to help pay for that.
And I think the Assessment and Accountability Bureau, as Vanessa was saying in one of her last slides, they are going to be doing some professional development, not necessarily on the instructional piece of it, but at least helping to understand the system. But it's a dilemma, John, for all of us.
And John, if I can help answer that too, I think what I would add is that the experience with the PLA list, or with the Reform Office this last year, and I think I've shared with this board without mentioning the school, my son's best friend, who I've known since he was born, is a teacher in one of these schools, and it was a tough meeting for me in that school a year ago because this school did not see itself in that regard. I wouldn't tell this story except for it's unbelievable what they've pulled off in a year, and with limited support, actually. I mean, the best we can, but a lot of it is driven by the principal and the staff, what they decide to do, how they're going to tackle their issues, how they took data. When I asked the key question a couple of weeks ago, we're data-driven now. We're data-driven now. We understand where our weak points are now. We just didn't. This is like every other thing that people go through in life, pretty much. It's not till you have clarity about where those strengths and weaknesses are that you can deal with it. And but I also want to acknowledge, I think Bill Miller, who's the new head of MAISA, and we had a conversation yesterday, and I really appreciated that he's even finding ways to take administrative money, which theoretically they could just keep for administrative work, and that we pass on through the relationship that Sally mentioned, the schools, the statewide system of support with MAISA, and looking for other ways to build on these supports. And Vicki, sitting here, I can't help but mention, I mean, Oakland's renowned for the kind of support it gives all of its schools. So, I mean, it really does rely on this rich resource we have in our state, which are ISDs. I mean, with good, thoughtful, well-trained people, and then the local knowledge of their districts, local enough to really understand the nuances of how to help them get better.
And can I just add real quick? I think it's, in addition to harnessing and aligning the ISD's resources, which is terrific if we can do that. And I think it's, it's incumbent upon us to just keep encouraging, as we are eager to help implement much of what the governor and we share in common, and implement a fulsome accreditation system. The governor and legislature, and I know they're appreciating this, we in the department need the resources to be able to deliver the kind of support that is required in implementing the laws, the reforms. We're going to talk later about all the other areas of teacher improvement. So I just want to reinforce the importance of us having the capacity to do the things to make this really work.
Thank you for that. Kath, Mary Ann, and Richard.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for an excellent, very, very clear presentation. You did a great job. David, too. You had the bulk of it, so it was very, very well done. But it took an hour for you to explain this system. And I understand the reasons for being complex, and you want to make it fair. But how do we get, it's going to be the whole dissemination of this system out to the field, much less the public, is going to take a lot of doing, and that really concerns me because it is very complex. And if you have to explain it to us who understand a lot of it, going in to people who don't, I'm concerned about that. I don't know how we do this. That's going to be a real challenge. And at that point, the dashboard that you have as a draft, I wondered why we have EdYes and AYP in there first, because I think that might confuse people, I don't know, I'm just throwing this out as my gut reaction to this. This is complex enough without throwing in something else, and we're not including AYP in this, so why?
Well, don't forget that that's the current system.
Yeah,
The current
yeah.
system is
That is
EdYes,
the
which
current-
includes
Yeah.
AYP.
Well, and it's a draft, what we showed you was just a draft concept of our overall school report card,
Yeah.
which will still include AYP as its own federal accountability, as well as accreditation, as well as some other things about schools. So that was a draft of that. I think it's an excellent point. I'd like to just share a little bit about what our plans are, because as we alluded to in the slide, we're trying to devote significant resources to planning how we're going to support this in the field. So the dashboard display with the ranking, we're going to make use of interactive technology, hover overs and what does this mean type of thing, so you can kind of interact with your ranking. We found this year, being out in the schools explaining last year's ranking and the PLA, that when you see it with your data, it makes a lot more sense. We've had a lot of, again, those 30-plus presentations, we've done about 28 of them, so we've learned a lot about how to communicate this, and we hope to try to translate that into our online interface, as well as, like Dave said, develop modules. We have an extensive plan for in-person support, being out in the field. Really putting this fall, my unit will put the bulk of its resources in making ourselves available to make this as accessible as possible. We don't think that we can gain any purchase by decreasing its complexity, because we'll be back to where it wasn't as fair, but we know that we need to now devote a lot of energy, or this fall or whenever fall, whatever fall this gets implemented in. We need to devote significant energy to making sure that people can access the information. So.
Okay, well, I do think it's a vast improvement over the previous versions, so I'm grateful for that. But I had a question about the ranking, and I know you explained it, but I'm not sure I quite got it all. There's no subgroups. We're not doing the subgroups, but I wondered how is that going to comply with NCLB requirements or ESEA requirements? We're not calling it NCLB anymore, but it's still there.
So for our federal AYP, we'll still do all the subgroup calculations as required by our accountability workbook and the federal NCLB legislation. In the statewide system, we would not use those subgroups in the ranking. We would do it with the alternate top 30, bottom 30 to look at achievement gaps. But the federally required AYP subgroup calculations remain consistent with what we're required to do under that legislation.
Okay, well, I think I had some other questions, but maybe somebody else might want to say something first, so I'll check.
Thank you, Kath. Mary Ann.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for all your work here. I had a couple questions, and they've largely been answered. I was one of the ones concerned with the punitive measures, and I'm wondering if within the box on consequences, if we can also include in there some reference to availability or recognition of assistance that would be available as well, or somehow helping districts within that 3-year span, so that they're not just left to their own devices for that.
The consequences listed on that slide was taken directly from the statutory language, so it's not something that we determine. It's required it's what's required in statute. So
I think what Mary Ann's getting at, though, if we
wouldn't-
added a little bit of information about, even
Yeah.
though it may be
Sorry.
somewhat limited, what kind of assistance could be provided to the schools.
Or
Is
links.
that where you're going, Mary Ann?
Right.
And possibly links to,
Yeah, we can do that.
And then,
MAI.
thank you. Then the other concern I had, you mentioned with regards to ESEA that if there are changes, the plan is regulated to fit into that. How much of this plan would you say is based on ESEA right now? Or is this mostly
Almost none.
ours?
With the removal of AYP, there's very little interaction between the federal requirements and the state requirements. But not knowing what ESEA will do, for instance, if they change the full academic year rules for students, we would want to think about aligning how we think about full academic year for federal requirements with how we think about it for state requirements, for example. But, the way the system is specified right now, there's little to no interaction with the federal law.
Okay.
So possible changes would be minimal then?
We would anticipate
Okay.
that.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mary Ann. I think it was Richard, and then Nancy, and then Dan.
Okay. Now the 6 areas of school operation: administration, curriculum, staff, plant, and facilities. These are, so that's 4. And school community relations. And then the 6th is performance?
School improvement plan and student performance.
Student performance, okay.
They're listed together in statute.
Okay. So these 6 areas are all required by statute.
The statute says that an accreditation system needs to address 6 areas of school operation. Statutory language doesn't say all, but as you can see, our proposed standards do address them all.
And for the first 5, you basically rely on the school improvement plan and then visitations to confirm that the plan is truthful?
We rely on the performance indicators and the school improvement plan, which in terms of, this also goes to the question of support around the non-performance data.
Okay.
As you all are probably well aware, the school improvement planning process is an extensive, detailed, well-researched, well-supported, really rigorous process that schools go through. All these proposed standards do is say, did you do it? Did you do this great process that happens elsewhere?
Yeah.
So it looks here like it's pretty just a checkbox, but it's really keying onto a very full set of work that a school does continuously using data, using a multifaceted team. So I think that I see your point that it looks it looks small when it gets slotted into a slide here, but it really is like if you clicked on it, or if it had a hover over, it would go into this.
Yeah.
Very large
Well,
thing.
here's my real concern. My real concern is that administration, curriculum, facilities, these are all means, and the end is student performance, student education. And I'm comfortable. I mean, if the statute says you look at these and so on, I understand that. But my real concern is that facilities are not equal to student performance. If you're teaching basketball, I guess you need a gym. If you're teaching Chinese, I don't know that the presence of a gym or its absence ought to determine the accreditation on the school. So I guess I'm throwing out this idea, which I hope my colleagues will agree with me on, that we ought to make a distinction between means and ends, and to that end, I think that the composite score, which tries to account for the complexity in trying to compare schools and take into account the ceiling effect, it looks to be a big improvement. I think we need to emphasize that in some ways it's arbitrary. I mean, like the bottom 5% are unaccredited. That's in one sense it's arbitrary, but at the same time I think it's meaningful. We can then focus on the students' welfare in those bottom performing schools, and I'm hopeful that this will prove useful and that we can successfully interpret it, I guess, to the public at large.
it was Nancy and then Dan,
Um,
and then Carolyn.
First of all, let me thank you again, as is becoming a litany here of thanks. But I think one of the things that is most important is that we have the people, the right people, clearly, in place here that not only understand the statistical background and nature of this and the plus or minus error, shall we say, of putting something as difficult as this together. But I'm very grateful that we have those of you here that can help us understand in common English, plain English, what all of this is being talked about and what it means and what the ramifications are. Certainly, Kathy is absolutely correct that this is not going to be a walk in the park to make it clear as pie to everybody instantaneously. However, the very nature of this beast is such that it can't be. And my guess is we're not unique, that all 49 other states in the Union who wrestle with this have the same problems and concerns. I am confident, however, not being one to boast, that Michigan has the people in place that can do that. And so I thank you for that. I think one of the things we have to wrestle with here, and given the amount of conversation we've had, it's very clear that this is something we wrestle with. What we are wrestling here with is a human attempt to put our hands around something that is so very important to us and so very critical to not only the success of our schools and to our children's success, but also our feelings of self-worth and value. And that really, every single district, and as a member of a local school board, you understand this too. I sat on a local school board for a long time as well. You have a tremendous sense of pride and feeling of self-worth. And you have a feeling that everything you are doing in your district is going towards the success of your students and to the success of your community in which you live. So when you come up to any accreditation system, let's face it, it's threatening. No matter how well constructed and no matter how well meant and how well being supported, in fact, it's still threatening. And so I think we need to be careful about how we use the words like punitive. I think we need to regard that more as consequences, natural consequences, if you will, because when we use the word punitive, we have a tendency as human beings who are threatened to equate it to the terms of not fair or even mean-spirited. And I don't think any of that's true. I think this is an attempt to help in a statewide system, in a statewide policy, to create the best understanding of what it takes to be a successful school. And so this means and ends that Richard talks about, I believe is true, but I think it's that attempt to wrap your hands around a very human instinct of being threatened that has created the means and ends differentiation. So I would ask that as a board we quickly support this so we can move on and all of us get out and talk with people about the very human elements that this touches in our lives, but the very real need to assess whether or not we're doing what we need to do. So those are my thoughts.
Words are important. Thank you. Dan.
Let me add my voice to the chorus of those singing your praises for good work and much improvement over the last effort. So thank you for that. It's clearly a lot of hard work has gone into it. So I think I've got 6 questions here. So my apologies to everyone at the rest of the table.
We're just going to go have lunch. You go ahead.
One is the top to bottom list. That applies to all schools, or are certain specialty schools excluded?
It applies to all schools. The only small exception to that are shared educational entities, which are schools that serve students from multiple districts who have specifically applied under a separate program instituted by the superintendent to be considered a shared educational entity. but there's no, for instance, anything like Title I status doesn't apply here to consideration for the top to bottom ranking. And it's a handful of those shared educational entity schools. They need to meet a set of criteria to be able to have that designation.
Okay. There may be a follow-up
And
there.
I guess I should also clarify, to receive a ranking, you have to have at least 30 students tested in this year and the previous year in at least 2 content areas. So there will be a number of very small schools that would not have a sufficient number for the top to bottom ranking, but they would still fall into the accreditation system because we would still expect that they would meet the other factors. And the reason for that N size is the reliability of the calculations.
Okay. There's probably a follow-up there, but just probably too much in one day to figure out exactly what it is. Second question. So I guess this one was answered really with the fact that there would still be AYP calculations based on subgroups. I guess I just want to register. So I understand exactly why you're proposing to calculate achievement gaps based on top 30% and bottom 30%. My concern there, I guess the question is whether or not there is any effort at the state level to disaggregate that information by subgroup or any other, right? Just so that if, for example, in a certain school it is girls who are performing, right, disproportionately poorly, that could be brought to everyone's attention. So I want to register that while I understand that the calculation as a whole maybe should be based on top 30% and bottom 30%, that I'd love to see that data disaggregated for purposes of capturing data.
That's a great point. I think one of the things that we see in the power of the portal and sharing this data are things just like that. I mean, where we actually can see the benefit of sharing this data and seeing where schools are actually outperforming. We've done the beating the odds, which I think was a great start to that. But actually finding out where are we doing well in a certain school, in a certain group, with certain groups, and then let's share that information. Let's actually provide that as a future outgrowth in the portal. I mean, maybe those are things that we would add as we build on. So that's a great point, I think.
Yeah. So it might not be included it wouldn't be included in the calculation, and it may not even be publicly shared, but your point is very well taken that that's useful instructional information to know who's in which part. And so and every school will have access to their individual student level data file, so they could look, but we can, we're still building, so we can build in some way to make that information more accessible. That's a great suggestion.
Third question. So I noticed that there are some data is based on 2-year averages and then some based on 4-year slopes, so the high school graduation trend based on 4-year slopes. Can you just explain to us quickly why you chose to use 2-year averages for the other, why that internal inconsistency exists?
Yep. So the 2-year average on the achievement is, as we said, to eliminate the possibility of one kind of blip year, but not totally get rid of it, because it's not clear from if you see 30% proficient one year and 80% proficient the next year, and you've only got 2 years, you're not sure which year was the blip, to be honest, and both were real aspects of performance, so you go to an average between the two. But we don't want necessarily to keep that one of those blips for 4 years because it would unnaturally move that average around. In terms of improvement, however, when you're looking at a slope and change over time, the 4-year helps it to be a more stable measure versus kind of just from year to year it might look like this and then like this and then like this, and a 4-year slope helps make it more smooth. So it's just a difference between in one, it's a status measure, how did you do this year, and we want to kind of put some protection in for schools to say this year, well, we're not going to go on 1 year alone. Improvement, it's more how have you been doing over time, and for that we want a longer trend line to play into the question of how are you doing over time.
And you do some grading testing too, the slope. The adjacent year.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have to do the slope in the subjects and grades where there isn't the adjacent grade testing. So.
And why? So I understand. So we're capturing graduation rate, achievement data. We want 2 years so that the blips disappear a little bit faster. In terms of improvement over in graduation rates, we want a 4-year slope. So why? I'm sorry. What did you just say? Give me I lost 41-year-old mind. I apologize.
I think it's the key difference between if you're looking at a status measure of how did you do this year We want to put some averaging around it to make it a little bit more stable.
Oh.
But if you're looking at improvement over time, you want to look a little bit longer in the history, because
So this gets to it, I'm sorry. So for grades 3 through 8, though, our improvement over time, the 1/4% based on improvement is still, we're still capturing 2 years worth of data instead of
that's
4
true.
there.
So
Why
with
not
the,
use 4 there?
thank you. With the reading and math, where there's the adjacent grade testing, when we have individual level, performance level change of a student, we feel it's we can be more precise about what really happened for each kid. So the aggregate there for the school isn't how did each cohort do from year to year. It's how did those kids, each kid do, and you roll that up to the school level. So it's a more precise measurement at the baseline level, like at the kid level. So we don't need as many years of data to look for the trend, because the trend's more exact at the input point.
Okay.
By the way, my wife's rating of me as a husband, my slope is pretty good. It's been it's been there one of it.
Oh, my.
Please, Dan, I know you had one.
Thank you for that. Number 4. So have you applied this data to, so you must have, right, run all the schools and their current data through something to see what would have resulted by now, right?
We have not.
No?
Because
Okay.
we're still in the process of getting these standards approved. So it's hard to it's hard to write the code and batten down any sort of system to test it. We do want to test it, but this is a part of the process. These aren't approved criteria yet. They're not approved standards. So we've been building, and we hope, we hope the approval process will continue and we'll be able to do it soon. But even to know what to test, we're still developing what might be tested. So are we going to go with 30% or, we're not,
So do
we
you need
have not done it
approval
yet.
by us in order to get comfortable enough to be willing to test, or do you need approval by the legislature in order to get comfortable enough to test?
It's a time-consuming and expensive process, so we can't keep trying to test out increments of it. So when we have the approval from the legislature, then we can start to build a system to really do that.
Wow, that's tough. I have no idea how expensive it is, and if you tell me it's expensive, I guess I will take you at your word. It seems to me that it's pretty difficult it's a lot harder to sell it, I would think, without having had a meaningful test of it. So I just wonder what could be done about that. Next question. So you mentioned that you could potentially implement it this year if things move quickly enough. When you say implement it this year, do you mean get the first year of rankings, or do you mean actually generate, 3-year averages such that you would know, like, what schools would face those kinds of consequences?
It wouldn't, so it would be the school year 11-12. At the end of the school year, it would potentially, if it went all the way through the approval process, but we wouldn't go back retroactively and say you would have been unaccredited in 2008, because Education Yes is our accreditation system right now. Education Yes will produce accreditation grades this year, hypothetically, and it did last year and the year before. So there's no retroactive aspect to this.
Okay.
We will use multi-year averaging in the ranking and in all the calculations as described here, but it will just be for 1 year of status designation.
Okay. So nobody would face 3 years. Got it. Okay.
Have to mature.
One quick note. So I would agree entirely with Mary Ann and with John about making sure that we offer assistance as part of the process. And I just want to note that really should be offered in years 1 and 2 of unaccredited status, not in year 3. So in year 3 you face consequences. In year 1 and 2, that's when you have the opportunity to improve, right? So on and so forth. So let's not wait until the hammer's about to fall to say, oh, and you can get this help too. That's right. As soon as you end up unaccredited or even potentially interim accredited, given that we're talking about really just the bottom 20% of schools being potentially on that list, getting them the assistance they need.
And we do, Dan, if I may interject on that part, we do have some experience with that because of the system I talked about earlier, the reform, where we've gone into this one school that I mentioned that is subject to takeover, and the turnaround they did with supports and a lot of the work on their own. So I think in a way the good fortune of that reform office being in place for a year is it's really helped us understand the very point you're making. You got to get on it right away. And that's what we're doing with those schools. Linda, if you have anything to add to that.
A couple of things. We are providing a lot of assistance across the state with the ISDs as well as with our own staff in how to do school improvement, which gets into part of what you asked about earlier, the school data profile that every school has to look at, asks about how are your subgroups doing, how much is attendance a factor. So we look at a variety of data and ask schools to analyze that data and make some decisions about what that means about student progress and what interventions might be needed. And then our staff is also helping schools to put into place the school improvement plans, and where there's funds available, how might they utilize those funds in order to make the improvements that they'd like to make. And if not, how do they use their other funds that are just generally available to them?
Linda, is that, so it's both a help and a burden, right? Certainly.
You got to do the work.
Right, right. Is that asked of everybody, or just the bottom 20%, or where's your cut for that?
Everybody, every school that, every district that receives Title I funds is required to have all of the schools in that district, Title I eligible or not, complete that work. And all schools in the state do the school process profile, which is the process side of it. Do your facilities work? Does your administration support? Do you have enough professional development in place to help schools, teachers do what they need to do? So almost all schools in the state do all of that work.
Last comment and question. Once again, thank you guys for great work. It occurs to me, so we kind of started, got onto a conversation about assessments and so on early on in your presentation, and I think we're barking up the right tree there. So all of this stuff, this accreditation system, depends on, given that so much of it tracks back to student achievement and improvement, depends on having an assessment system that accurately, fairly, regularly measures student achievement and improvement. And I guess I would just request for future meetings kind of a briefing on the work of the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium. I'd love to know now, as opposed to a year from now or a year and a half from now when the work is done, really what's influencing the work of that consortium, what we think today that assessment will really look like, how that data is gathered, so on and so forth.
Good idea. I think it was Kath and then Matinga.
I just wanted to say, I think Dan's comment about would this look for districts, if you you'd use this system, is the kind of question the legislators are going to ask. Because I know when I worked for the legislature, the fiscal agencies always did this kind of analysis, and they wanted to see how it affect their districts. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if they're going to approve it without asking these questions. This is a very valid question, and I think you should think about it before we go to the legislature with this.
Well, I would just suggest there's another way of looking at that, and it would be to have legislators making a decision on whether or not they're going to approve something based on how it affects the districts in their area, I would think would kind of give you a different tenor and a different way of looking at it. If this is going to be a political decision rather than what's a fair system, I think it adds a different nuance to the whole.
It does, but that's the kind of question they ask, so I think you should be prepared to get the question, and how you answer it, you could answer it like that.
Matinga, John, Richard.
Yeah, and I'm going to take a huge leap there and say that I think I'm speaking for the majority of Michigan teachers. I really believe that what you guys do is so incredibly important, and I don't believe that the testing or the assessment or even the accreditation system I don't think we believe is punitive. Tests are not punitive. Tests are meant to be measurements. I think what feels punitive is the way that those results are then used. If I am coming from a community that has uber committed parents, and I rank in a certain way, and another teacher is teaching from a community that is not, the parents couldn't find the school system on a map. There's going to be a huge disparity, but we're going to use that to rank each other. So what's going to feel unfair is like, you come from, Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and I don't. Therefore, your ranking means nothing to me. So I think that universally, all of the testing, assessments, accreditations, we need that. How else are we going to measure the baby? How much has he grown? But if you can use that statistic as a personal, okay, this is what we need to do, we need to get more community involvement. We need to do more things as opposed to as a political tool or as a whiplash, as a whip to lash the, schools. So again, as teachers, we do want testing, we do want measurements, but we don't want to be in the middle of how these things are used.
Yeah. You can't control how people interpret things.
Right.
That's the problem.
Context again a little bit. What people, I think, as community members, parents, teachers, and students are going to see very soon is this array of richness. Because let me throw in one more example. This board and the governor have supported the idea of a bonus for student achievement growth in addition to the funding that's in place now. And so that would be more like almost a beating the odds measure in one sense, because it's about student growth no matter where they are. So you're going to have different things. You're going to have a measure on here that might talk about accredited or not. You're going to have a measure that might say that would be added. If we didn't add it ourselves, I think the local district that got the bonus would want something in their brag part over there about received it. So you start to get I've used this example because I turned out to be a much worse baseball player than I thought I was in my own mind. And it's because you pick and choose the stats for a while, and then you realize, yeah, there really are a lot of strikeouts there. But on the other hand, I hit a home run once in a while, and you get a double. So what I'm getting at is I think you'll start to see through what David was emphasizing, this array, and just one example of something that would be strictly based on growth. Not any of this other would be the bonus based on student achievement growth. And that's going to be something, I think that would be not only well received by districts because of the money itself, let's say $400 a kid or something, but it's also going to be something that is a status issue. We receive, so I'm and that one.
That affects real estate.
Well, all
prices,
of this.
It affects real estate prices. If my
But
district is in the bottom, whatever. It's a community, it's a fallout, an entire community because of a little brag measure on your website. It's
well,
data misused.
Right, but I'm making a little different point. The one on student achievement growth, in some respects, some could say favors districts with low socioeconomics. You're more likely to get growth. And it's a little bit about why they changed the slope business on the 90% with the high achieving schools, because at what point do you say, well, you're already 92 and you did a little tilt and we're penalizing you for that, so that's out. But I'm just saying, I'm probably confusing this in a way by adding that. I'm just saying there are measures in addition to accreditation, interim accreditation, that are whole other levels. And I think people are going to know a lot more about that stat, because did you get the bonus or didn't you get the bonus? That's going to be very clear because of all the discussions and almost the mania, legitimate mania, but about money. And that one will be based on showing that you took kids from who hadn't been read to perhaps, but came in and still was able to get this year's growth from a child. That's going to be not only, I think, a prestigious issue and a money rewarded issue, but something to brag about that's really hard to do. I've lost track, I'm sorry now. Was it
me and
John?
Richard?
John and Richard?
I want to
Cassandra?
I'm trying to be helpful to Dan and Kathy's point. Why don't we run the numbers? I think one of the concerns or suggestions was that we were already implementing a revised accreditation system prior to its full understanding approval by the legislature, et cetera, et cetera. And it's much healthier for us to be approving and proposing a revised accreditation system based on thoughtful standards and good metrics we think are appropriate, not looking out the other end to see which schools it kicks out, but based on what we think is the right recipe. And so that's just by way of encouragement why it might make sense for us to continue on the path of getting the standards right and the recipe right and recommending it and having Mike recommend it to the legislature, not as a fait accompli, but as a thoughtful, better way to look at which schools are kicked out. And just to try some, on the testing, I just will balance the equation. I'm for more testing all the time, testing everybody. that's the way I introduce myself. When I talk to young people, it's still hard for me to get them to understand, what do you do on the State Board of Education? You know, shaping education policy doesn't work for teenagers. So I said, we're responsible for the MEET test and the Michigan Merit Curriculum, and that gets me hooted out of any auditorium right away. So, but at least I know I connected, so.
Yeah. You're a brave man, John. Richard.
And this is the man that warned me about throwing bombs out there. So.
He didn't say to kids, he only said
well,
here.
Okay, yeah, right. Well, yeah. I just wanted to observe, I think we need to be upfront that, you know, when we're talking about accreditation, we're talking about putting a value on things. And it's no wonder this is a little controversial, because we're already, you know, already a fifth of the schools are going to face a judgment. And it's painful, but I think we need to do it for the sake of addressing students' needs. So it's like, and so there is a concern, what will be done with this test? When I would see the doctor and he'd take my temperature, okay, sometimes what would follow would be that shot in the rear, which probably why I never wanted to be a doctor. But I think that's what we need to strive in our accreditation system, is to get a thermometer to identify. And again, it's not, there's more to medical science than the thermometer, and we certainly must embrace that. And occasionally you can get a false reading.
Particularly at our age, Richard, we got to watch out.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Occasionally you get a false reading, but I think we do want to strive for something that's reliable, that we can compare to a standard, and then take appropriate action for those that don't measure up, and not in the sense of laying, you know, of finding a scapegoat that we can blame, but rather identifying when you got a fever, you know you've got a problem, and now you analyze the problem rather than punish the sick.
Can I just make one clarifying point?
Sure.
You mentioned a fifth of schools might face a judgment. Just wanted to clarify that the bottom 5% potentially face a judgment. So the next 15% up to that 20% would be interim accredited off the top to bottom ranking. That's before you apply the factors. I just wanted to be, that has been it's been a very big confusion in the field, and so I just want to make sure we dispel.
But out in the field, it's the value judgment, which is more important than any other consequence that may be faced.
Thank you. That's an excellent point, but just so there's no further misunderstandings
I
about
sure.
the 5 versus the 20 in the interim. And
I understand.
Thank you. Sorry.
And I think, if I may, on the value judgment, I mean, measures that Dan alluded to, as we may or may not, as a board department team, think are important, we can always exceed and show through what we call light of day information that we think is helpful. It could be drilled down data related to gap. And so the reason I'm saying that is, even then we'd want to shape it based on possible demoralization. Is it really helpful? Is it fair? But I think one of the things we need to do as a department is be more thoughtful over time about points like that Dan made earlier, and then try to aggregate them into things we can add to a portal. We can add whatever we want. We're the Department of Education. You're the state board. No, I'm serious. Because sometimes this is one reason when the stuff that we worked through for a long time here now, if our concern really was stigma, which I don't hear in fairness that at all lately, but did for a while, there's all ways that outside that aren't these minimum requirements of accreditation that one could put a package together on a portal that could stigmatize districts. So I think the idea is, how do you over time get fair information for parents and students, particularly as this choice world is opening more and more. I think that Reggie used to be a pretty thoughtful and eloquent champion for saying, do parents really understand what can happen and what is happening with children in a given school, and how do you get proactive? And that's when we started onto this kind of light of day thinking, that we have an obligation, which isn't punitive at all, it's strictly information, but in a way that's proactive and helps people really understand choices they're making. And because saying this with Billy in the room, and I saw Dan earlier, because I think this sometimes stigmatizes charter versus non-charter. These are all public schools, and we need to understand which schools are serving kids in what way, and the more information we can give, the richer, and we can exceed what we're talking about today. But we'd want to do it in the same kind of way that we're not thinking about accidentally stigmatizing, but in the case of Dan's example, it may be drilling down on the gap. I thought you were thoughtful in the way you described that, but let's face it, it's still an issue there if we don't do something along those lines by just having 30-30. And that doesn't mean we can't exceed that. We can choose as a SPE and department to do so. Not in this process, I don't mean, but I mean just as a portal information, for example, that David made. Dan, rather. Wasn't David. You're David. You're David.
So just, I want to clarify two things. Maybe it may just be one now. I'll shortly be 42, so
Three. There are always three things.
Right, there are always three.
Gets worse.
Does it get worse? The first is, so the whole point about testing first, just my only issue there is not around arming legislators with information about how their district or their schools in their district would perform, but just about answering the fairness question, right? So how do we know this will be fair? Like, it would be great to maybe, I don't know how to do that well, but so if you look at the current top to bottom list, if you took the top school and the bottom school and ran them through and made sure that the top school, you know, would actually have been interim accredited or accredited for the last 3 years, and the bottom school, you know, I don't know. I don't want to get into the specifics of it, but it just seems to me that it might be worthwhile just around answering the fairness question, or saying something around first year, this gets implemented, you know, we revisit it after 12 months to yada, yada, whatever it is. And there was a second thing, and it didn't come back, so I'm all done. Oh, I know what. You know what? I want to acknowledge publicly my friend Dr. Z's color. As a group, I think our metaphors become more and more colorful the hungrier we get. And I appreciate the colorfulness of the last metaphor. I'm not a doctor either.
Okay.
Introduced an ocean and a whole medical industrial complex of analogy. I think we must pick up and use both. Maybe think of a third.
Very good.
That's our new recipe. Cooking stuff.
There we go. We have a third domain. That we have three good analogy domains in which to operate exclusively. We may not speak in any other way for the rest of the day.
I'll design a plate for that.
You never support everything we do, Mary.
Well, speaking of that, maybe time to let our guests as well as ourselves get some nourishment and come back. Good cutoff point. Sound right?
Yes.
Okay, so, but want to limit it to 1 to 45 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
45 minutes, we'll come back.
Yeah.